Yeah, I'm Tony Clifton, and in that time I was based in Hong Kong for Newsweek magazine as a correspondent, and that meant I covered, along with some colleagues, the whole of Southeast Asia and South Asia, which meant I was basically alternating between here and India, and also Vietnam. So I was going from one war to another. Dhaka was a very obscure town in an obscure part of West Pakistan. So the news came out of West Pakistan, really. And so we became strongly aware of what was happening here because of the movement of refugees, not because of what was happening in Dhaka, but suddenly millions of people crossed the border into West Bengal and camped around Calcutta, and these were horrendous camps with people just packed together, and very serious plagues, particularly of cholera, swept through these camps. And I remember going to a camp where there were literally dying people spread in over an acre, and I said to the commandant, how many people are here? And he said, I don't know, 10,000. I said, how many of them die? And he said, do you want to see children die first, or do you want to see old people die, or do you want to go and watch some young people die? And it was as bad as that. So it was a refugee story that concentrated on the plight of the refugees. And then, of course, you have to ask the question, well, why are these people moving? And that led us into doing two things. One, the main one was getting into Dhaka, and the Pakistani government would give us visas because although I'm Australian, I was working for an American organisation, and Pakistan was very dependent on the Americans at that point. So reluctantly, they gave people like me visas. And on the other occasions, we would sneak across the border, the West Bengal, into the border villages. But the main reporting, I suppose, or the main story developed through the words of the refugees in the first place, because the border villages weren't particularly badly hit. And of course, in Dhaka itself, we had minders all the time. You had no freedom, so you couldn't go out to the scene of a massacre in Kulna or something and look at bodies. You would have to go secondhand through the reminiscences of the people who'd seen these things, and people, people would show us their wounds. They would start crying when they talked about how their family members were assassinated. They would just break down. So it was clear that nobody was faking this. These were terrified people. For the most part, you didn't see too many women and children. They were hidden away. So you would talk to male villagers, and in fact, the stories you heard were the stories you were getting from the refugees across the border. So in other words, there weren't massacres going on along the border because, of course, the Indians were on the other side, and the Pakistani army was keeping back from the border. So they were not so much liberated as, I would say, sort of free areas. Terrified people, but not being physically harmed to any massive degree. The guerrillas, particularly early, weren't a factor. I mean, this was the Pakistani army on the rampage, and there was really no opposition to them at that point. So what would happen is that if I'd be in Dhaka, I would be walking along the street, and a man would walk alongside me and start talking out of the side of his mouth, and he'd hand me some papers, or he'd hand me a photograph, or I'd get in the elevator and a member of the staff would start telling me about things. I wasn't, to be honest, I wasn't aware of a serious guerrilla movement. Well, the war came to Dhaka because the Indians were bombing and strafing all the time. So long before the Indian Army appeared, this was just about the tallest building in Dhaka at the time, and the Indian fighter bombers were coming in sighting over this hotel on the way to bomb the airport. So you'd have these warplanes roaring, And the Pakistanis, on the other hand, had fighters, and you'd see the most extraordinary dogfights, which are almost impossible to see in a normal jet war because they normally fought much higher. But you would see planes exploding at 1,000 feet, and there'd be anti-aircraft guns. It was like being in the middle of a movie. There's a lot of action. And then we, of course, knew that the Indians were coming, and then the day started to come when they got close to us, and you would see along the horizons tall columns of black smoke, oily smoke that you get from burning vehicles. And it was clear that they were closing in, and they were closing in almost encircling the place. And so you've got these fires. And then one day General Niazi, I suppose about a week before the finish, came into this hotel. He was the commander. And he said, "Indian tanks will run over this chest before we surrender in Dhaka." And we thought, well, there's going to be a battle for Dhaka. The place is going to be burned to the ground. We'll all be killed. It's going to be very nasty indeed. Maybe there were 40, 50 journalists from about 10 different countries. When the Indians started to bomb the airport, it became apparent that very soon we'd have to make a decision to leave or not, because there would be a last plane. And so I think the Pakistanis must have organised this. They said, any of you want to leave? And about half the people just panicked, the journalists. And I remember one German crew left tens of thousands of dollars worth of TV equipment and everything behind. So I guess close to half left. The Indians finally came in on the 16th of December, and the fighting had died down, and suddenly you couldn't hear the artillery, and the fires were starting to die down. And then the first Indians appeared. I think General Aurora certainly was near the front in a jeep, and he drove through, followed by other jeeps, and people started rushing out onto the streets because finally they saw Indian soldiers in a turbaned Sikhs, and they realised it really was over. And women suddenly appeared on the streets in a way I hadn't seen for months, because people had kept them inside because of rape and because of kidnapping. And suddenly the street was full of girls and women in beautiful saris and waving little red and green flags, and extraordinary mood of joyousness. The people literally danced in the streets, if you like. The surrender, it was one of those things. It was at the racecourse, and the extraordinary thing about the two armies were they were both at that time led by soldiers who trained under the British and been part of the British Indian Army. So General Niazi, for instance, had a British Military Cross, which is a high decoration. And he and Aurora sort of shook hands, and I think they'd both been at a college in England together. So there was this very strange formal greeting. It wasn't, the beaten being kicked and whipped across. It was much more like two teams meeting after a particularly vigorous sports match. Very curious. It's the sort of formality you find in the British Army all over the place. These people have the same traditions because they've been brought up in the English manner, and their decorations and their badges of rank are very, very British. So it was a very curious, given what we'd known had happened in the past, the formality of it was rather curious. And I suppose that a small tragedy was that the Aurora's adjutant was shot by a Pakistani soldier who were all carrying, and died in his jeep just as Aurora came in to celebrate. And I remember this young soldier lying back, and he was a Sikh, so his long hair just was falling out of the back of the jeep, and he'd been shot through the head, and so that added an edge to it. But in general, it was a rather theatrical signing, and it seems to me that it must have been in the evening, because I remember the television lights, and they'd set up tables for the signing, and so it must have been, I think, early evening. I went to see Brigadier Siddiqui, who was Niazi's intelligence officer, I guess, and I said, well, it didn't work, did it? And he said, no. It worked perfectly. We held our positions were all in place. We're in Kulna and we're in Sylhet, and it's exactly as we planned it. And then I saw General Jacob, the Indian guy who run the operation. And he said, what we did was we went around all these entrenched positions, so there was hardly any fighting because of Pakistan. He stayed there, and we just went round them and came to Dhaka. But I should say it wasn't as pleasant as that, because there was, as you know, there was a lot of killing going on at the finish, and you would come out every morning and there would be dead bodies in the streets of people who'd been shot and dumped the night before. So the Americans believed that Vietnam, the Americans were pulling out. So there was the firm belief that in the domino theory that Vietnam would go communist, and then it would take it moved down into Southeast Asia, go through Malaysia into Singapore. And so that was, the Americans saw the advance of communism there. And at the same time, the Americans were terrified that the Russians would come down through Pakistan to warm water ports. And of course, in those days, the Indians were considered to be allies of the Russians. So the Americans were determined to support the West Pakistanis in this, because they saw West Pakistan as a crucial link in the chain of anti-communist countries from Turkey through Iran under the Shah. And so it was very much that the Americans were prepared. The Americans knew what was going on, because we know about the Consul Blood, who was reporting, and Kissinger very famously said, issued an order, tilt towards Pakistan. So the State Department was under orders, more or less, just to gloss over what the Pakistanis were doing here in the interests of keeping up the anti-communist wall. At the start of that year, although I'd been a war reporter in England, I'd worked for the Sunday Times, and I'd come from Biafra just before. But I wrote a story called The Dreadful Bloodbath at Tika Khan, which caused a huge stir because it was about the way Tika Khan was just crushing people. And Newsweek, although they hardly knew me, published it in full. And they believed what I wrote, and they believed that I wasn't making up the names of people who gave me these blood-curdling accounts of what had happened. And so I was treated very well, and I also, to this day, think this was a war where the press played a more than observer role. I think that we really, I'm proud of what we did, because we really drew the world's attention to what was a fairly unimportant war in the world context going on here. And we spent a lot of time and a lot of money and went to a lot of dangerous places to get the story. And I think the story echoed with the people who are reading about it. And I think that there was a sympathy towards the freedom movement here, which might not have occurred at another time. You know, journalists go in as neutrals, and quite often you find that there are really bad guys and there are really good guys. And in this case, it was fairly easy to see who the good guys are. And of course, in retrospect, seeing the way Pakistan has fallen apart, can you imagine if somehow Pakistan had managed to hang on here? You know, you would have had a military dictatorship here and Taliban bases up the road. It just would have been awful. So it was very important that Bangladesh broke away then. And then seeing it now, I haven't been here for about 8 or 9 years, and it's quite extraordinary the way this city's exploded. You know, it really was. You know, it's a backwater when I spent most of my time here. Now it's this enormous, vibrating city. Oh, it wouldn't have occurred to me. You know, it's and I was astonished when I was asked to come over here 40 years later. You know, I thought, God. I mean, I always felt self-rewarded because I thought we did very well in that story, so I didn't need any more reward. But it's very not only gratifying that you get a formal recognition from the government, but for the government to bring you here and show you the new country is even more rewarding. So the whole thing has been a wonderful experience for me.